Right, everyone, probably about time for us to begin. So hi, welcome to the Primary 6 Science Revision Program, and I believe you are all here because you all know that no matter what happens this year, your PSLE is still gonna happen. Right? So have you all started revising for your science? Primary 3 science, Primary 4 science? Okay, so for today, we're going to be covering this particular block, which is the life science segment of the lower block. You know that for this holiday program that you sign up for, there'll be a 4-part series, so there'll be 4 lessons in total. So our first lesson today will be emphasizing on lower block life science. Okay, so let's go. So this is the structure of your science paper every year. So in booklet A, which comprises 28 MCQ questions, you have about 14 marks dedicated to life science and 14 marks dedicated to physical science. So it's about half-half, right? Then in booklet B, your open-ended and structured questions, we also have about a half-half weightage for physical science and life science as well. All right. So for today's lesson, we're looking at lower block, particularly since we're looking at life science, we'll be looking at diversity of living things. We're looking at life cycles. We're looking at the plant and human systems. All right, so I hope these don't sound totally foreign to you. Okay, so let's recap diversity of living things. So this has been snatched right off your PSLE syllabus. So in this particular topic of diversity, you should be able to describe characteristics of living things, how they need water, how they need food, how they need air, how they can grow, respond, and reproduce, right? And you should also be able to recognize and differentiate between these groups of living things. What's the difference between flowering and non-flowering plants? What are the difference between the different types of animals that we're talking about here? What about the 3 different types of fungi? And how is bacteria different from the rest of the groups? And we are also expected to observe and infer differences among the variety of all these living things we're talking about, and to classify these living things based on similarities and differences. So this is right off your PSLE syllabus. So what you want to know is that even though interactions in the environment has been removed, you can still be tested on simple behavioral adaptations. So when you're doing your revision for these lower block science topics, make sure you do not skip this area. All right. The other thing is that you need to remember the characteristics that each group has. What is a differentiating characteristics? For example, when I talk about insect, what things come to mind that only insects have that other animals don't have? If I say birds, what are some characteristics that are specific only to birds and no other animals have, right? So, first question. Describe how birds and insects are similar and different based on their characteristics. They want similarities, they want differences specific to these areas, right? So if you answer specific to the question, part by part, we shouldn't go wrong, right? So based on this, the only thing that is similar between both birds and insects is their reproduction. Both of them will lay eggs. But in terms of differences, birds have 2 body parts, insects have 3. Birds have 2 legs, insects have 6. Birds have feathers, insects do not have feathers. Insects have a hard outer covering, or you can say a hard outer exoskeleton. And the young of birds usually look like adults, but the young of some insects do not. So yes, Caden, you're right. We have to specify that not all insects will resemble their parents. Okay, so yeah, interesting, good. Bird eggs are protected by a hard shell, but what about insect eggs? Are insect eggs also protected by a hard shell? It's just that the material that eggshells are made up of will be different from the ones that are making up the eggs of the birds. Okay, so you would therefore need to remember that the characteristics that differentiates one animal from the other group. So for birds, the most specific thing that is unique to them would be the presence of feathers. Even my drinking bird has a feather. So all birds, even drinking birds, have feathers. It's exclusive to birds only. All right, no other animal will have birds. No other animal will have feathers. Then what is specific What is specific to insects? Insects have a bit more, right? They have specifically 3 body parts. Insects have 3 body parts. They have 6 legs. So they also have an outer hard covering. So anybody happens to know what that outer covering is made up of? Yes, 6 legs and 3 body parts. Very good. Yes, an exoskeleton. What's the material that's made up of? So C, does anybody know what's the exoskeleton made up of? Calcium is what bird eggs are made up of. This C word called chitin is the material that insect bodies are made up of. Okay, we call it chitin. Only insect bodies will be made out of chitin. There's some chitin that's found on fungi as well, but don't worry, you do not really need to know that. Okay, so let's go on to the next question. Here I've got animals P, Q, R, and S, and they can be classified using this particular chart. Which one of the following correctly classifies X, Y, and Z? So body covering have scales which do not have scales. So P, Q, and R all have scales. The amphibian is the one that does not have scales. Okay, good. Now, next one. Hakim found an animal in a stream in a forest. Which of the following characteristics can he use to identify? That means to just use one characteristic to differentiate whether this particular animal is a fish, an amphibian, or a reptile. So if I look at the presence of gills, will it help me to differentiate between a fish, an amphibian, or reptile? So I know fish has gills, but both the amphibian and the reptile may not have gills. So I still won't be able to differentiate between an amphibian and a reptile if I were to go with A, right? So the actual answer is to ask ourselves, or the characteristic that can differentiate all three is the ability of this particular animal to live on land or in water. So if you take a look, only fish have gills. The young of amphibians, like the tadpoles, may have gills as well. Okay? Type of body covering. Both the fish and the reptiles have scales. So I won't be able to differentiate between a fish and a reptile if I'm going to go by body covering. Method of reproduction. Which one lays eggs? All of them lay eggs. Most fish lay eggs, right, at least. So I wouldn't be able to differentiate that as well. But if I ask and use the ability to live on land and in water, the fish lives only in water. Reptile lives mostly on land. And amphibian are the ones that are amphibious in nature. They can live both on land and in water. So it is D that will help us to differentiate between these 3 groups of living things. Okay? Next question. James left 2 pieces of bread in identical jars X and Y. He added a few drops of water to the bread in jar X, and then he covered the jars with airtight lids, and the diagrams show the results after 5 days. So usually, for myself, I will actually write on the diagram itself for why there's no water. So based on this, does it help me to differentiate? I realize when it has water, my bread is actually moldy. But without water, my bread only turns slightly moldy. So this already gives me a certain connection as to what could potentially result in a different amount of mold, right? So how does using airtight jars allow James to carry out a fair test? And B, another similar piece of bread was now toasted in an oven and then placed into an identical airtight jar. What will James expect to see after 5 days? So if you take a look, the first one, how does using airtight jars? What is present in air? So airtight jars basically prevent air from coming into the experiment. So there must be something that's present in air that could potentially affect the experiment. So what is it specific that is in air that could interfere with the experiment? Let's look back at the experiment again. This one has water. This one has no water. So what is present in air? An abundance of water vapor, right? So if I don't use airtight lids, that means both breads will have access to the abundance of water vapor. So in the end, there is no variable. They'll both have access to equal amounts of water if the airtight jars were not used. So using airtight jars will prevent excessive water from the air from interacting the bread. So the amount of water in the jar will be the only one that will affect the amount of mold, not the amount of water that's in the air. Okay? Part B, another similar piece of bread, and some of you directed your answer towards heat. But if it's toasted and cooled after 5 days, then it wouldn't remain hot after 5 days. So what an oven does is that if you heat something in the oven, what do you realize about your toasted bread? It's hard, it's crispy, and it's dry. So a piece of toasted bread will have even less moisture than an untoasted one. So if there's even less moisture, if there's even less water, then I will expect that there'll be either no mold or less mold than the bread that was found in jar Y. Okay, so you have to make connections to this experiment. This experiment was investigating water as a variable in relation to bread mold growth. So your questions are also approaching this with respect to moisture, with respect to bread mold growth. So you got to see how this whole question is actually linked. So give a reason. Because a toasted bread will have less water than the bread in jar Y. So you can either say toasted bread has very little water or no water that is needed for the mold to grow. All right. Okay, next one, we're going to the topic of life cycles. In this particular topic, you need to be able to show an understanding that different living things have different life cycles in terms of its stages, both in plants and in animals. So it's not just the number of stages. You should be able to also specify what is the name of each stage. Okay, so you should also be able to observe, compare life cycles of plants grown from seeds over a period of time. So usually it's seed to young plant to adult plant. Then what's the difference between a young plant and an adult plant? You also will need to know the difference of life cycles of different animals, specifically the butterfly, the beetle, the mosquito, grasshopper, cockroach, chicken, and frog. So remember the stages and characteristics at each stage. At what stage do they resemble adults? Do they resemble the adults at all? Do they not resemble the adults? What do they feed on at a particular stage? Do they not feed? For example, in the pupa stage and the larva stage, is there feeding in both stages? Right? Okay, so this particular diagram shows the life cycle of a bean plant. This is not a PSLE question. So based on this particular question, what can the plant carry out at stage Y, which is here, that it cannot carry out at stage X? Stage Y, we have an adult plant. Stage X, we have a young plant that has just germinated. So if you observe closely, it does not even have its true leaves yet. It's still got its seed leaves, right? So because of that, at stage Y, yes, everybody knows that it can produce seeds. But at stage X, as a young seedling, it cannot produce seeds. The second thing that can happen at stage Y is that it now has true leaves. So with true leaves, it will be able to photosynthesize and make its own food. But at stage X, it does not yet have its true leaves. So it will not be able to photosynthesize. Okay, but at both stages, they have roots and they will still be able to produce new leaves. Okay, next question. So the Aedes mosquito is our friend this year that spreads dengue fever during this period. So the graph below shows the amount of rainfall and the number of dengue cases in country A in the same year. Based on these two graphs, state the relationship between the amount of rainfall and the number of dengue cases from March to August, and explain why this relationship is observed. So from March to August, what can you tell in terms of the trend? Mosquitoes need to breed, and water helps in the breeding. But specific to this question, which part of the life cycle or which part of the breeding is this water necessary? That is where you need to specify and elaborate your answers. Okay, so as the amount of rainfall increases, the number of dengue cases will increase. So almost everybody got this same relationship, either expressed in exactly the same way or slightly different. With increased rainfall, there will be more water that can be collected. Or you can say more stagnant pools, more water pooling. And this water pooling or this stagnant waters will allow mosquitoes to lay their eggs. So it is not specific enough to just say, oh, with more water, then they can breed. Breeding is usually more linked to male mosquito meet female mosquito. But specifically, which part of the life cycle will this stagnant water help? So you're going to tell me that with stagnant water, now my mosquitoes have more places to lay their eggs. So if these eggs hatch, then there'll be more mosquitoes to spread dengue fever. Okay, so that's your 2 marks. Part B, the number of dengue cases, sorry for the spelling, takes 3 to 4 weeks to change after the amount of rainfall changes. So there's some information given here. Dengue fever takes about 2 weeks to develop after a person has been bitten. So give another reason why the number of dengue cases will not change immediately after the amount of rainfall changes. So you cannot tell me what is already inside the question. Okay, so I'm going through this because I don't want you to tell me, oh, because it takes 2 weeks to develop. So basically, another reason why the number of cases will not change immediately is because eggs take time to hatch. Other than the 2 weeks for the symptoms to develop after the mosquito has bitten me, the mosquito lay eggs, it takes about 2 weeks or so before these eggs will develop to become female mosquitoes. Okay, so this one is still quite okay. It's the next question that would be interesting. So this is a bit tough. Male mosquitoes do not bite. They don't spread dengue fever. When a male mosquito that carries bacteria W mates with a female mosquito, then the eggs that this female mosquito lays will not hatch. So in one particular year, these male mosquitoes carrying bacteria W were released into an estate. So now explain why the number of cases in this estate decreased after that. So again, make sure you do not restate things that are already mentioned in the question. Basically, I will have more eggs that will not hatch. So I will still have female mosquitoes in my estate. But when these female mosquitoes mate with the male mosquitoes carrying bacteria W, what happens is that the eggs that were going to be laid by the female mosquitoes, they will not hatch. That means I will have a smaller population of female mosquitoes in the end that will bite humans. Hence, the number of dengue cases will decrease. Next part, let's go into the systems. So we still have human and plant systems to go into. So for human systems, we're looking not just at the reproductive system. This is one of them. We're also looking at other systems like the reproductive systems as well. Okay, so your basic knowledge will include skeletal system. What is its function? You do not need to know specific bones. This is the skull, this is the ulna, this is the radius, this is the femur, this is the tibia. No need. Okay. You also need to know how muscles that are in the gut or your digestive system actually help to move food through this muscular movement, to push food through your digestive system. You need to know that your heart is a muscle, and when you breathe, there's a little flap of muscles under your lungs called the diaphragm, and this is also helping us to breathe in and breathe out. Using the letters A to E, where does digestion take place? Where does absorption take place? Take note, it's not small intestines. There's only a small intestine, singular. Likewise, it's not the large intestines, it's the large intestine, singular. All right. Okay, using the letters A to E, identify where digestion occurs. So there are digestive juices that are produced by the mouth, the stomach, as well as the small intestine. All right. So it's only A, C, and D. There is no digestion that takes place in the gullet. Okay, take note, there is no digestion that occurs in the gullet because there are no digestive juices. Where does absorption occur? Absorption occurs once digestion has concluded. So in the small intestine, there are two functions. The small intestine digests everything to its smallest possible form, and after that, absorption will start to take place in the small intestine. So in the small intestine, digested food molecules are absorbed. Then in the large intestine, any residual water will also be absorbed. Okay, so absorption and digestion takes place in the small intestine. Small intestine has dual roles. Okay, so let's recall that. Next one. Let's look at this. Let's choose the answers from here. Which of the following activities is or are carried out in the stomach? Okay, the correct answers are actually A, B, and D. Okay, because basically the stomach produces gastric juice, which is a type of digestive juice. So because it has digestive juice, it will be able to break down food. Specifically, what does the stomach break down? Breaks down proteins. Okay, so you should be able to roughly state what types of food are being broken down in which part of the digestive system. Then, because the stomach is just above the small intestine, it actually controls the amount of food that enters the small intestine, and it releases food into the small intestine a bit at a time. Okay, so now let's go on very quickly to the last part on plant systems. So you must be able to identify the different parts of the plant and state their functions. So what's the function of the leaf? Its main function, for example, is to trap sunlight and to make food through photosynthesis, right? What's the function of the stem? To support the plant, for example. And what's the function of the root? To absorb water and mineral salts. Next, you need to identify parts of the plant transport system. So this is actually upper block science, but because it's easier to consolidate everything in the same topic, so we'll be actually doing this together under plant systems, even though it's supposed to be lower block. So we can combine lower block and upper block in this case. Okay, so you need to be able to state there are both food carrying tubes and water carrying tubes, and you need to be familiar with the experiments that come with them. Okay, so Percy plucked a leaf from a plant and placed it in a beaker of hot water. He observed that bubbles formed only on the upper surface of the leaf. So based on his observation, which one of the following conclusions is correct? This picture that I'm showing you on the chat is basically showing you a lotus leaf, a water lily leaf. So for water plants that float on the surface of water, I want you to take a look at where the stomata is. See the word stomata? Where is the stomata? Is it on the upper surface of the leaf or is it on the lower surface of the leaf? It's on the upper surface. So this is something that is not so well known, but I would need you all to recognize that not all stomata is found on the lower surface. Okay, so it is possible for stomata to be found on the upper surface of leaves. So based on that, the best answer here is therefore not D. D comes from the assumption that stomata is only found on the lower surface of the leaf, but this is not true. There are stomata that is found on the upper surface. And based on this particular observation, bubbles form only on the upper surface of the leaf. That means that my stomata are found on the upper surface only of this particular leaf. So the correct answer here is C. Alright? So stomata are usually found on the lower surface of the leaf. But stomata are not only found on the lower surface of the leaf. On a normal leaf, there is usually more stomata on the lower surface than the upper surface. But on water plants, especially plants that are floating on the surface of water, their stomata are usually found on the upper surface of the leaf. Okay? So I hope that gives you all some clarity. So therefore, D is not the correct answer. Okay? Next, Abraham set up the following after removing the roots. So take note, he removed the roots. So in your answer, you should not be describing anything to do with roots. Okay, then he positioned the air bubble. Position of air bubble was here. And then he observed how this air bubble moved for the next 1 hour. So in which direction would the air bubble move? So basically, I'm looking at the air bubble that was originally here. So I know that with or without roots, my plant is still able to transport water because there'll be water loss from the leaves through this process known as transpiration. Right? So due to transpiration, water will be moving upwards along the stem. So if it's losing water along the stem, that means it will have to absorb water in this direction. So essentially, my air bubble will either move towards the plant or very simply, it moves leftwards and give a reason. So that's exactly how I explain. Because the plant, with or without roots, will still absorb water through its water-carrying tubes, or Caden could tell me specifically through the xylem vessels. Alright, so this will cause the movement of water leftwards. When the water moves leftwards, the air bubble will also move along with the water. We can't use the word root because the roots have already been removed in this experiment. Okay, now let's very quickly. Ham now repeats this experiment with a fan blowing on a plant. And then he observed that now this air bubble, it moves leftwards more quickly than in the first experiment. So explain why. So I'm not sure whether you remember the factors that affect the rate of transpiration. So there was an acronym for it, WHAT. What? What? Wind. Okay. H stands for humidity. A refers to exposed area of the leaf. That means how much are my leaves big, are my leaves small. And T stands for temperature. So I don't have time to go into detail how each of these affect the rate of transpiration, but these are the same factors that affect the rate of evaporation. Okay, so you may have to go back to revise. So in this case, the presence of wind is the one that is affecting the rate. So the plants will lose water through its leaves more quickly because wind will cause the rate of transpiration to be faster. So I don't need to go into detail. So since it loses water more quickly, it will then absorb water more quickly as well. Then you don't actually need to explain how this will affect the movement of the bubble, but you just need to be able to at least tell me that presence of wind, low humidity, greater area, and higher temperatures will cause the plant to lose water more quickly. So if a plant loses water more quickly, it will absorb water more quickly as well. What? To help you remember the factors that affect not just evaporation, but these are also the factors that affect transpiration. Okay, so maybe I'll write this down for you. These are factors affecting either evaporation or transpiration. Parts of a plant are shown below using arrows. So I'm just going to give you a quick time to just imagine how the arrows should look. So how would you draw the arrows? We definitely know that roots will move water upwards towards the stem. Then from the stem, where does the water move to when it comes to leaves and flowers? You'll move to both the leaves and flowers, right? So your arrows will look like this. Now, insects eat their way into a tree trunk and explain how this will affect the growth of roots in the tree. Okay, so basically, if the insects are feeding on the food, they are in the food carrying tubes, there'll be less food that will be transported towards the roots for growth and development. So you must be able to tell me exactly which are the tubes that will be affected. Because if insects are eating means they are going to feed on the food. They are not feeding on water that are in the water carrying tubes. Okay, so if they eat the food that's in the food carrying tubes, less food will be transported from the leaves to the roots. So I will either have less roots, or my roots will be shorter, or my roots cannot grow as well. Okay, so that's how you state the effect. That's right, Kaden. Okay, yeah, you can even mention all the way that all the food carrying tubes could have been destroyed. Okay, so that's another possibility. All right. So at this point, I need to ask, are there any questions for what we've gone through so far? So the plant, it did not state that the plant is a water lily plant. Yes, and we do not need to know whether it is a water lily plant or not. But based on the observations showed that only water bubbles will form on the upper surface. So without knowing there's a water lily, I can still know that the stomata are on the upper surface of the leaf only. For next lesson, take note, we are going to be covering this diversity of materials, cycles in matter, forces, energy forms and uses. So you may want to start preparing your revision and gearing up towards these topics first. Okay? Then with this, I will see you next week, next Monday, next Wednesday, and next Friday. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop me an email, or you can just leave the feedback. When you close this window, there'll be a feedback, and then I will be able to respond to it as well. Okay? Or you can still use the chat box to type in any questions if you need to. Okay, so thank you, children. I'll see you